There's a particular kind of madness that takes hold of people when they suddenly come into more money than they know what to do with. You have probably seen it on a smaller scale. A lottery winner who is broke within 5 years. A young athlete who signs his first big contract and surrounds himself with people who help him spend it. The pattern is so consistent, so predictable, so thoroughly documented across human history that you would think we would have learned by now. We have not, and neither had Germany. In 1871, the newly unified German Empire received the financial equivalent of winning the lottery, inheriting a fortune and closing a blockbuster business deal all on the same afternoon. France, having just lost the Franco-Prussian War in one of the most humiliating military defeats in European history, was forced to hand over 5 billion gold francs as a war indemnity. 5 billion. In an era when the entire annual budget of the German state was measured in the hundreds of millions. It was an almost incomprehensible sum of money, and it arrived in Germany all at once, like a flood through a door that was never designed to handle that kind of pressure. What happened next is one of the most dramatic, most instructive, and most strangely familiar economic stories in all of history. It is a story about greed and delusion and the particular arrogance that comes from confusing luck with skill. It is a story about what happens when an entire nation decides, collectively, that the normal rules of financial gravity no longer apply to them. And it is a story that ends, as these stories always end, with a crash so severe it sends shockwaves across the entire Western world. But it is also, and this is a part that tends to get left out, a story about what comes after the crash. Because what Germany built from the rubble of its own financial catastrophe was something extraordinary. A financial and industrial system so disciplined, so sophisticated, so strategically intelligent that it turned a nation of recent origin into the second largest economy on earth within a single generation. The boom was spectacular. The bust was devastating. And the rebuilding was nothing short of genius. This is a story of the Gründerzeit. And if any of it sounds familiar, it should. To understand the scale of what happened, you need to understand what Germany looked like at the moment of unification in 1871. For decades, the German states have been economically strangled by their own fragmentation. 39 separate political entities, each with its own currency, its own customs regulations, its own legal system. A merchant trying to move goods from one end of the German-speaking world to the other faced a bureaucratic obstacle course that made trade slow, expensive, and deeply frustrating. Capital was cautious. Investment was local. Ambition was bounded by borders that made no geographic or cultural sense, but existed anyway because that was how things had always been. Then, overnight, all of it disappeared. Bismarck's unification did not just create a new country on the map. It detonated an economic explosion. The internal customs barriers vanished. A single currency replaced a patchwork of local coins and notes. A unified legal framework replaced a labyrinth of local laws. Suddenly, the largest free trade area in continental Europe had been created from scratch, and every businessman, banker, and entrepreneur who had been sitting on the sidelines waiting for exactly this moment came flooding in at once. And then the French money arrived. The combination was incendiary. You had a newly unified market of tens of millions of people, a legal and financial infrastructure that had just been modernized in a single stroke, decades of pent-up entrepreneurial energy looking for somewhere to go. And now, sitting on top of all of it, 5 billion gold francs that needed to be put to work. The German government used some of it to pay off war debts and build out military infrastructure. But a very large portion of it flowed directly into the private economy. Into banks, into investment funds, into the pockets of a new class of financiers and promoters who looked at this river of money and saw, quite correctly, that the opportunities were enormous. What they did not see, or chose not to see, was that opportunity and delusion look almost identical in the early stages of boom. The Gründerzeit, which translates roughly as a founder's era or the promoter's era, was what followed. And in its early stages, it was genuinely remarkable. Real companies were being built. Real infrastructure was being created. The German railway network expanded at a pace that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. Steel production surged. Chemical plants went up. Textile mills modernized. Coal output doubled. The foundations of a genuine industrial powerhouse were being laid, and the people laying them were not wrong to be excited. The problem was what grew up alongside the genuine development. Because wherever real opportunity exists, the speculators are never far behind. And in the Gründerzeit, the speculators arrived in force. New companies were being registered at a rate that made serious financial minds deeply uncomfortable. Between 1871 and 1873, more than 900 new joint stock companies were incorporated in Germany, capitalized a combined value of over $3 billion. Banks that had not existed 2 years earlier were suddenly issuing shares. Railway lines were being projected through territories where nobody had bothered to check whether the terrain was actually suitable for a railway. Real estate in Berlin was changing hands at prices that bore no relationship to any rational assessment of its value. And through all of it ran a current of absolute certainty, the unshakable conviction that had infected every participant in every speculative bubble in history, that this time was different, that Germany was different, that the normal rules did not apply here because this was a new era, a unified nation, a destined superpower, and the money was never going to stop coming. It stopped coming on the 9th of May, 1873. The date has a name in Austrian financial history. They call it Black Friday. Though what happened on that day in the Vienna Stock Exchange was not so much a single dramatic event as it was a moment when an entire financial system looked at itself in the mirror and finally, unavoidably, recognized what it had become. Vienna went first. But Vienna and Berlin were connected at the hip financially, and what collapsed in Austria did not stay in Austria. Within days, a panic had crossed the border. German stocks began to fall. Then they fell faster. Then the selling became indiscriminate. The kind of selling that is no longer about rational assessment of value, but about pure animal fear, the desperate need to get out before the person next to you gets out first. Banks that had looked perfectly solid a week earlier were suddenly facing runs. Companies that had been valued at extraordinary multiples of their actual earnings were being marked down to fractions of their issue price. And the 900 new joint stock companies that had been created in the fever of the Gründerzeit began, one by one, to reveal themselves for what many of them had always been: empty vessels, paper constructions, vehicles for transferring money from optimistic investors into the pockets of clever promoters. The crash was not over in a day or a week or even a month. What followed was a prolonged economic depression that lasted, in various forms, for nearly 6 years. Historians would later call it the Long Depression. Unemployment rose. Wages fell. The construction boom that had been reshaping German cities came to an abrupt halt, leaving half-finished buildings standing as monuments to misplaced confidence. Small investors who had put their savings into the new companies of the Gründerzeit lost everything. The middle class, the very class that unification had promised to empower, took the heaviest blow. And the anger that followed the financial wreckage was enormous. There's always a search for villains after the financial collapse. Always. It is one of the most consistent features of boom and bust cycles throughout history. When the money was flowing, everyone was a genius. When it stopped, everyone needed someone to blame. In Germany in 1873, that blame fell on several targets. The promoters and speculators who had floated worthless companies were obvious candidates, and many of them faced genuine legal consequences. The banks that had financed the speculation without asking hard enough questions were pilloried in press. Politicians who had overseen the unification boom without putting adequate safeguards in place were accused of negligence. But there was also, and this is one of the darker chapters of the story, a surge of anti-Semitic scapegoating that used the financial crisis as fuel. Jewish bankers and financiers, many of whom had played prominent roles in the Gründerzeit investment boom, became targets of a propaganda campaign that blamed the entire catastrophe on Jewish financial manipulation. It was a lie, as such campaigns always are, but it was a lie that found receptive audience in a population that was frightened and angry and looking for a simple explanation for complex disaster. The anti-Semitic political movement that grew from the ashes of the 1873 crash was a genuinely ominous development, one that would cast a very long shadow over German history in the century that followed. But that shadow, as dark as it was, did not stop Germany from doing something that very few nations in history have managed to do after a catastrophic financial collapse. It did not wallow. It did not retreat into protectionist paralysis. It did not abandon the industrial project that the crash had temporarily derailed. Instead, Germany looked at the wreckage of the Gründerzeit, asked itself with brutal honesty what had gone wrong, and began to build something fundamentally different from what had existed before. The rebuilding started with the banks. Before the crash, German banking had been a chaotic and largely unregulated affair. Banks had been created quickly, capitalized thinly, and run with an enthusiasm for short-term returns that made them structurally fragile. What emerged from the Long Depression was a completely different model. The great universal banks, institutions like Deutsche Bank, Dresdner Bank, and Commerzbank, began to operate in a way that had no real precedent in the financial world. They did not simply take deposits and make loans. They took equity stakes in industrial companies. They sat on the boards of their clients. They provided not just capital but strategic guidance, long-term commitment, and a stability that the speculative finance of the Gründerzeit had never offered. George von Siemens, the first director of Deutsche Bank, understood something that the promoters of the boom years had never grasped. That sustainable industrial development required patient capital. Money that was not looking to double itself in 18 months and get out. Money that were prepared to sit inside a company for a decade, absorb losses in the lean years, and participate in the gains over a genuinely long time horizon. This was not a charitable impulse. It was a strategic one. Siemens and his peers had watched the speculative model destroy itself, and they had drawn the obvious conclusion. The way to make serious money in an industrial economy was not to inflate asset prices and sell before the collapse. It was to actually build industries that created real value over real time. This model, which economic historians call relationship banking or the German model of industrial finance, did not just stabilize the German economy, it transformed it. Because when a bank has a long-term equity stake in a company and seats on its board, it has every incentive to help that company succeed rather than simply to extract fees from it. It will provide capital for research and development. It will support expansion into new markets. It will absorb short-term losses rather than pulling credit at the first sign of trouble. It will think in decades rather than quarters. And the companies that grew up under this model of patient, engaged, long-term banking were not the flimsy paper constructions of the Gründerzeit. They were industrial giants. Krupp expanded its steel and armaments operations into an empire that employed hundreds of thousands of people and supplied governments across the world. Bayer and BASF, the chemical companies that had grown out of the synthetic dye industry, became the largest pharmaceutical and chemical manufacturers on Earth. Siemens, which had started as an electrical engineering firm, grew into a global technology company. AEG, the electrical conglomerate, was building power stations and tram networks across Europe and beyond. By 1900, less than 30 years after the catastrophe of 1873, Germany had become the second largest economy in the world, behind only the United States and ahead of the British Empire that had once seemed untouchable. Its industrial output had surpassed Britain's in key sectors including steel, chemicals, and electrical equipment. Its exports were flooding global markets. And the financial system that was driving all of this was not the reckless, speculative, get-rich-quick machine of the Gründerzeit. It was something much more formidable. A disciplined, strategically intelligent, long-term oriented partnership between banking and industry that allocated capital to its most productive uses and refused to be distracted by short-term noise. The lesson that Germany's financial story teaches is not a comfortable one, because it does not fit the narrative that most people prefer when they think about economic success. We like stories about visionary entrepreneurs who had a brilliant idea and changed everything. We like stories about technological breakthroughs that disrupted existing industries. We like stories about individual genius rewarded by a free and open market. Germany's post-crash story is not that story. It is a story about something far less glamorous. It is a story about institutional design, about the deliberate, patient construction of a financial and industrial architecture that was built not for excitement but for durability, not for spectacular short-term returns but for compounding long-term strength. And the reason that story makes people uncomfortable is that it implies something they would rather not hear, that how a society organizes its relationship between money and industry matters, at least as much as the talent and ambition of the individuals within it. The Germans did not become more talented after 1873 than they had been before it. The engineers and chemists and industrialists of the post-crash era were not smarter than their predecessors. What changed was the system around them. The incentives shifted. The time horizons lengthened. The relationship between capital and enterprise became a partnership rather than a transaction. And the results of that shift were so dramatic, so measurable, so historically documented, that they are impossible to dismiss. Consider what Germany achieved in the 30 years between the crash of 1873 and the opening of the 20th century. It built the world's most sophisticated chemical industry from scratch. It created the pharmaceutical sector that today underpins global healthcare. It produced more Nobel Prize winners in science than any other nation. It constructed a railway network that connected every corner of the empire and became the logistical backbone of the most powerful military machine in Europe. It developed an electrical industry that was literally wiring the modern world. It trained a generation of engineers, chemists, physicists, and doctors whose work shaped the 20th century in ways that are still unfolding today. And it did all of this on the foundation of a financial system that had been burned to the ground and rebuilt with a completely different philosophy. There is a conversation that serious economists and policymakers have been having for the better part of a century about what is sometimes called short-termism in financial markets. The tendency of financial systems, particularly Anglo-American ones, to prioritize quarterly earnings over long-term investment, to reward managers for boosting share prices rather than building durable businesses, to treat capital as something to be extracted from companies rather than deployed within them. It is a conversation about whether the financial markets that developed in Britain and America, with their emphasis on liquid, tradable equity and short-term returns, are actually the best possible model for financing industrial development. Germany in the late 19th century was, without knowing it, running the counter-experiment. And the results of that experiment were remarkable enough that they shaped economic policy across continental Europe, influenced the development of the Japanese industrial model, and generated a body of academic literature that economists are still arguing about today. The German model was not perfect. Nothing in human affairs ever is. The close relationship between the great banks and the great industrial companies created concentrations of power that were sometimes used in ways that were not in the public interest. The same long-term orientation that made German industry so formidable also made it slow to adapt when the world changed in ways that required rapid restructuring. And the nationalism that was woven through German economic policy from the very beginning carried within it the seeds of the catastrophes that would come in the 20th century. The same industrial machine that built Bayer and Siemens and Deutsche Bank also built Krupp's cannon foundries. The same financial system that funded pharmaceutical research also funded the most destructive military expansions in European history. But before any of that, before the wars and the nationalism and the catastrophes that would eventually consume everything that Germany had built, there was this, a nation that did not exist in 1870, a nation that received a flood of money it was not ready for, lost its mind, crashed, picked itself up, thought carefully about what had gone wrong, and built something better from the ruins. That is a story worth sitting with for a moment, because the instinct after a financial disaster, whether personal or national, is almost always a retreat, to become conservative in the limiting sense of the word, to protect what remains rather than risk it on something new, to let the memory of the crash make you permanently cautious, permanently small, permanently afraid of the ambition that got you into trouble in the first place. Germany did not do that. Germany looked at the rubble of the Gründerzeit and made a different calculation. It decided that the problem had not been ambition. The problem had been undisciplined ambition. Ambition without infrastructure. Excitement without institutions. Money without the wisdom to deploy it over the right time horizon for the right purposes. And so instead of retreating from ambition, Germany built the structures that ambition needed to become something durable. The 5 billion francs that France paid in 1871 are long gone. Spent, invested, lost in the crash, rebuilt and spent again across the decades that followed. But the institutions that Germany built in response to what that money revealed about itself, the universities, the research laboratories, the universal banks, the long-term partnerships between capital and industry, those lasted. They shaped a nation. They shaped an era. They shaped, in ways that are easy to underestimate, the world that you and I are living in right now. Every time you fill a prescription at a pharmacy, there's a thread that runs back to the chemical laboratories of the German Empire. Every time a bank sits on the board of a company it has financed, there's a thread that runs back to George von Siemens and the lessons of 1873. Every time a government debates how to structure the relationship between finance and industry, there's a thread that runs back to the Long Depression and what Germany chose to do about it. History is never really over. It just changes its clothes and keeps walking. If this story made you think differently about something you thought you already understood, then it did its job. There are 4 more videos in this series, each one pulling on a different thread of the same extraordinary era. The engineering, the medicine, the law, the politics. Each one is surprising, as consequential, and as relevant to the world you are living in as a financial story you just heard. Subscribe so you do not miss them. Share this video with someone who thinks history has nothing to teach them about money. And leave a comment below telling me which part of this story surprised you most. The boom, the crash, or what came after.